Hello Muscombe History Group, it's me again with another lockdown special. This one again is in two parts. Some of you will remember that at the beginning of 2020 we started our season with a story about coaching in the early days. One or two people have said they were sorry to have missed it, so now a slightly embellished version is going into the library. And Katie, this one's specially for you. Coaching the Great North Road. In part 1, we'll look at the history. The Celts, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, and then the Normans all contributed to the complex network of highways, byways, paths and tracks around England and Wales. By the time of the Norman conquest, the road system had become more of a network of pathways. There must still have been a national network such as the road King Harold Godwinson used to bring his army from York to London in 2 days. Only to face defeat by William of Normandy at Hastings. After the Norman conquest, feudalism meant that few people ever travelled beyond their parish boundaries. But the king and his followers, the lords and their ladies, and the bishops and their retinues, all had to progress around the realm, so some roads continued to be maintained by the barren landowners. Gentlemen and sporting ladies travelled on horseback, whilst gentle ladies and their children took a whirley-coat carriage, a sort of wagon with embellishments. Goods and materials travelled by light cart or wagon, but travel using any type of wheeled vehicle tended to be for the summer months only. In the winter, most of the roads became quagmires. Pedlars and tradesmen made their way around the country with mules and donkeys, and often had a train of mules to carry their trade goods. Craftsmen travelled to find work. Indeed, a time-served apprentice was called a journeyman because he had to travel beyond his master's territory to find work. And most people periodically needed materials and supplies to be transported by carriers' wagons. But many people with somewhere to go simply walked. This was not as impractical as it sounds. Even in the summer, a cart or wagon would only average about 2 miles per hour over a day's journey. Horse riding would perhaps make about 4 miles per hour over a similar journey. Walking had few restrictions from poor terrain and could average between 3 and 5 miles per hour. Even in the early 20th century, many people would walk 15 or 20 miles and be there for lunch. Horse riding was the preferred option for those who could afford it, but it was not always safe nor sensible to travel alone. It was best to travel in groups, with a local guide to lead the party, stopping overnight at inns, like this group setting out for the Canterbury Tales. Plagues and economic recession reduced the population. By the 14th century, travel became more common, with some larger towns attracted tradespeople from surrounding countryside and villages who often needed accommodation. A network of inns and hostels grew up around the country that offered shelter, food, and warmth to the traveller. Sometimes these inns became the focus for thieves and bandits to pick out their victims for ambush later on the road. particular group of travellers who went with relative safety were the theatrical players. The travelling players, with their stage wagons, moving from town to town to entertain and to educate the learned and the illiterate. By the time of the English Tudors, there were a number of towns and cities that had to be connected. Roads became the lifeblood of the nation's commercial activities, circulating around its heart in London. These roads were different. They were needed for commerce and not for military occupation nor for political control. As mobility increased, Henry VIII appointed Sir Brian Tuke to establish a national royal postal network to serve his court from a post office in Westminster. Tuke's postal network relied on horse riders who rode from post to post, with rights to change horses at every post, carrying letters and messages on behalf of the King's court. The Royal Mail was only used for affairs of state, and it was then used by Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, and also by King James I and VI for court correspondence. Then came Charles, but the Tudors had been very slow at spending public money, preferring instead to rob from other states like Spain or France. When King Charles came to the throne, he found Parliament withheld funds as a matter of habit. An arcane parliamentary finance system meant he never had sufficient funds from Parliament to meet the current cost of living like a king. Charles was kept short of money by Parliament to bring him to heel on issues like Protestantism. He had to find ways to earn money that Parliament could not control. Along with ship money and other creative schemes to earn money independent of Parliament's control, he made the Royal Mail a public service that conveyed letters and messages for any and all who paid the fees. To get money quickly, Charles sold the monopoly for the public postal services to one of his peers for an estimated £100,000. With the coming of the First English Civil War, Parliament had control of London and established the General Post Office in 1643 to control all national mails. It proved useful for John Thurlow, the Postmaster General, to have control of all mails conveyed by the venerable and sometimes aged postboys around Britain. After the Restoration of 1678, Charles II granted an absolute monopoly on carrying the mails in the British Isles to the General Post Office in Lombard Street. Postboys and a limited number of post office buildings, usually in inns and public houses, strategically placed around the country, became the entire postal service in Britain for the next 150 years. Twopence for deliveries within 80 miles of London, and up to 10p for a delivery to the Scottish lowlands. In the meantime, more and more people needed to travel, either on commercial or personal business. The highways and byways became more busy than ever before, and people needed to move themselves and their goods and chattels easily and with haste. By the early 17th century, large wagons copied from the theatrical stage wagons began to make their journeys from town to town. But this time, the stage wagons were carrying freight. These wide wheel-rimmed bulk carriers took people's commercial and personal goods between locations. The wagons were often massive, but carried bulk rather than weight. The wheel rims were usually at least 12 inches wide, so they could roll across the bumps and gullies of the trackways. These stage wagons carried goods for a fee calculated by the distance travelled. The distance became known as a stage. The stage wagon came to mean any wagon that carried goods by stages. People sometimes wanted to travel with their goods, or simply make a journey with companions and taking a rest from walking. It was not long before the stage wagon carried passengers as well as goods. Obviously, these people also had to pay for each stage of their journey. Indeed, the long wagon was especially built to carry 10 passengers as well as the regular load of goods and materials, but it was very slow and quite expensive. With the slow but sure stage wagon carrying people as well as goods, some enterprising businessmen saw a new commercial opportunity: the stage coach. Around 1660, entrepreneur businessmen obtained coaches and carriages cheaply to set up regular passenger services carrying people and their luggage over regular journeys more quickly and with greater comfort than the stage wagons. Initially, these coaches carried people over short distances to markets or trading ports, usually getting there and back within the day. But the need for longer distances meant that coach owners and operators had to arrange for services to be provided on these longer journeys. An example is this 1831 flyer advertising regular coach journeys from Birmingham to London. A place on this coach costs 21 shillings, that was 1 guinea in old money, with a £14 baggage allowance and 1 penny per pound for any excess baggage over the £14 allowance. The coach is operated by Nicholas Rothwell, and the small print of the handbill reminds people that Rothwell also operates a regular stage wagon over the same route. It was natural for inns, taverns and hostelries to be the staging points on the journey, as they could provide catering, accommodation and stabling for horses. So coaching inns were beginning to appear. It was not long before these establishments became well known to coach travellers and began to develop this part of their trade over and above their local custom. They provided stabling for changes of horses required by the passing coaches. Fast food menus for people travelling on the coaches where service stops were short and punctually kept. Bed and breakfast facilities for those who wished to break their journeys. The definitions of roadside houses now began to tighten so that travellers knew their entitlements from different hostelries. Inns had always been places where overnight shelter, food and drink could be obtained. Customers could carry on their business, Some inns also provided bedroom accommodation. Hostelries now became inns where bed and breakfast facilities were guaranteed for those who wished to break their journey, and stabling for their horses. During the coaching era, many hostelries will become coaching hotels. This word comes from the French. In French, it meant a place of convalescence and recovery from illness. Oag thought that this applied to a coach stopover in England. The stagecoach business began to settle down into two slightly different markets. There remained the stagecoaches carrying local travellers and connecting local towns and local markets. Those stagecoaches travelling over much longer distances and usually connecting London to the nation's provincial towns and cities. As the King's Highway began to carry more traffic, the cost and responsibilities for maintaining them became more acute and more than a little vague. Soon the roads began to suffer, and travel became more and more difficult as roads deteriorated. The traditional arrangement that the parish repaired their roads and the landowners paid for the maintenance of his roads going over his lands sometimes the roads in woods and forests will become overgrown and torn up by roots. Sometimes there could be so many tracks and paths that the true road was hard to find. And sometimes the road would be so mired and muddy it was impossible to make progress. And sometimes you met those gentlemen who wanted your money or your life. This was the time when long-distance travellers became vulnerable to road conditions, or simply getting lost in the poorly signposted and mapped country. In 1736, Robert Phillips wrote a dissertation concerning the present state of highways in England and particularly near London. In the summer, the roads are smothered with suffocating dust, with biting insects that attack from the roadside. Between wet and dry times, deep ruts form and fill with water, and there is a great risk of vehicles turning over as the wheels climb out of some ruts and drop into others. In winter, the roads are full of mud and dirt, and sometimes completely flooded, and sometimes deeply buried in snow, and always threatened by those men of ill intent. Most roads were the responsibility of the local parishes, which were unwilling to spend money on roads for strangers to pass more conveniently through their boundaries. Parliament therefore passed laws to establish turnpike trusts, bodies for maintaining the main interconnection routes that were to be maintained by the payment of tolls. By 1770, about 15,000 miles of turnpikes were established, and the network continued to grow as people realized money could be made from the tolls. This is the first time that Britain has needed a purely commercial network of roads, and the turnpike was considered the best way to finance it. Slowly, in some cases very slowly, the main roads improved. Metalled, gravelled, paved, or even cobble-set road surfaces began to appear, and from 1786 the best roads used Telford's and later Macadam's system of road building. By 1770, some 15,000 miles of turnpikes had already been established, and the programme continued to improve the road network. Labourers were employed to break stones and lay roads. The average labourer's wage for a 60-hour week of about £7 4 shillings and sixpence, less stoppages, that's £7 22.5 pence in modern money for a 60-hour week. But this is good money for the age. The market was competitive. Labourers had an opportunity at this time to double up as navvies, digging the canal networks which was simultaneously developing. The extras referred to could be the hire of a shovel for 3p a week, the hire of a hammer for 6p a week, and if you wanted a barrow, that would cost you a shilling a week. This interesting map of the turnpike and toll gates in Nottinghamshire is available online at www.flickr.com. This is the road we're interested in, and that's where we live. From around the 1770s, coaching came into its own, and more people wishing to travel than ever before in British history. And railways still had to be invented, which leaves coaches in a monopoly position. The tolls are paid for the maintenance of the toll roads and turnpikes. The toll was calculated on the amount of damage the transport was likely to cause on the roadway, so a formula of charges began to emerge. The size of the vehicle, the number of wheels, the number of horses or other draft animals, the weight of the load, the number of passengers being carried, even the width of the wheels, all went into the calculation of various laid down toll charges. Of course, the more popular the road, the more the travellers had to pay for travelling on it. And finally, we had to consider the amount of profits the members of the Turnpike Trust and the parish councils thought it was appropriate to make to invest in other road ventures. And of course, including their own expenses and costs. It's amazing how many members of the Turnpike Trust had turnpikes passing the gates of their houses. The improved turnpike roads meant that the stage wagons became faster and more handleable as transporters of goods and bulky items for the next 200 years. And the stagecoach becomes the standard way for people who cannot afford their own personal carriages and chaises to get around. Stage travel was still expensive, however. The cost of the fastest coach travel would be comparable with business class air travel today. Then, in 1785, a significant innovation was set to really change things. You will recall that since 1635, the Royal Mails had been carried on horseback by the postboys. This service was available to the public and was not too expensive, but it was clunky and inconvenient for all but state users who were based in London. John Palmer was the owner-manager of the Theatre Royal at Bath and the Theatre Royal at Bristol, the only royal theatres at this time outside of London. The two theatres had a single company, so actors and properties frequently had to be transported between the two. Palmer also had to make frequent journeys to and fro London to conduct his various businesses. His experience of travelling by stagecoach suggested that the stagecoach network could be a very effective way of delivering the mails. The postboy method was, in any event, known to be desperately inefficient, corrupt, and out of date. Palmer persuaded William Pitt, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, to allow an experiment where a private gentleman was permitted to carry the royal mails. At 4 p.m. on the 2nd of August 1784, one of Palmer's hired coaches left Bristol with the approval of William Pitt, carrying the royal mails on a run between Bristol and London. The result was surprising. Palmer's Bristol-Bath-London route took 17 hours to deliver all its letters. Postboys would take almost 36 hours to complete exactly the same task a couple of days later. Despite some stick-in-the-mud objections, Pitt was convinced and quickly passed legislation that allowed him to broaden the experiment still further. He pushed a bill through Parliament that would allow him and future chancellors to invite existing stagecoach operators to bid for the carriage of the royal mails over routes of their choosing. Meanwhile, Palmer acted quickly to maintain the momentum Pitt had created. He accepted Pitt's invitation to operate the Bristol-Bath-London route as a permanent arrangement, and he also bid for 3 routes where post houses were already in place. His bid was guaranteed to be successful. So, as well as the Bristol to London route, Pitt quickly contracted Palmer to create 3 new routes. Within a month, the service had been extended from London to Norwich, London to Nottingham, and London to Manchester. And by the end of 1785, various contractors were operating services from London to Liverpool, Leeds, Dover, Portsmouth, Exeter, Gloucester, Worcester, Holyhead, Carlisle, and Poole. A service to Edinburgh travelling via York was added in the next year, 1786. This service will be of particular interest to us in Part 2. It established the Great North Road. Palmer was rewarded by being made Surveyor and Comptroller General of the Post Office and retired a wealthy man. By 1797, there were 42 mail coaches servicing 4,110 miles of roads in Britain. These covered the entire national postal requirement for the sum of £12,416 a year. The postboy jockey service would have cost at least £25,000 for a less efficient postal service. The initial idea was that coaching operators bid for contracts with the GPO to carry Royal Mail along what were regular and timetable routes to and fro from London. The coaches would still carry the operators' paid passengers, but would have the authority and protection that had been carried previously by the postboys. But most of the operators saw these contracts as a way of maximizing their profits, sometimes with dire consequences for the fare-paying passengers. Along with the postal fees, they carried too many passengers for the coaches to be safe. Many coaching operators tried to maximize their profits by maximising the load travelling with the mails in heavy coaches, or racing coaches to beat competitors and win contracts, but often the race caused a smash-up. The General Post Office could not allow mail and passengers to be put at risk. It quickly stepped in and set a required standard for Royal Mail coaches. They adopted a coach designed and patented by John Besant. Besant's new standard pattern mail coach is built by John Veidler's yard at Millbank in London, who held a post office monopoly contract from 1827 to 1842, so Besant and Veidler did very nicely, thank you, out of the post office arrangements. The post office required the best average safe speed. For this reason, they restricted fare-paying passengers on the mail coaches to a maximum of 11 people. Some operators would carry up to 22 passengers on a coach very similar to the mail coach, exactly twice the post office restriction. And this photo, taken in 1913, demonstrates how it could be done, with 9 passengers sitting inside the coach and up to 13 passengers on top. Such a load is obviously dangerous. The coach is top heavy and the passengers are likely to fall, particularly from those silly little seats that they're perched on. Besant's design had several advantages over the coaches of the day. The front wheel arrangement meant that his coach could turn more tightly than the convention. The design of the wheel hubs meant that the wheels were much less likely to be shed. The original wheels were kept on simply by putting a pin through a hole on the outside of the wheel, but Besant's arrangement was a proper nut-fastened hub. It even had an automatic downhill brake, but this did not work well and was soon removed in favour of more conventional braking. It became law that all mails carried by coach had to use the Besant-designed, Veidler-built coaches, and soon the coach operators found they needed spare coaches to cover breakdowns and servicing. Veidler had a monopoly, so his coaches were expensive, costing the same as a top-of-the-range car today. That's about £150,000 equivalent. The GPO had to give consent that these coaches could also be used as ordinary stagecoaches when needed, because of the capital cost involved. Obviously, some coach operators didn't win a post office contract, and others didn't even bid, preferring to carry local customers without GPO restrictions, and this led to a separate evolution of public transport passenger vehicles. The heavy stagecoach, which we've mentioned before, continued to operate in many country areas. And in the north of England especially, the diligence was imported from the continent, where in the south of France and Switzerland it was used to carry passengers under more protection round the winter weather that was prevalent in Switzerland and was thought similar to that you experience in the north of Britain. Some hotels and other hostelries took shooting breaks to transport their guests to and from locations. And the private omnibus became even more popular as a conveyance for hotel guests in the London area. All over the country, the charabanc became the means of going out on summer trips for organisations, groups, and sometimes just crowds from a public house who wanted to go on a trip. And the fair stage omnibus soon began to find its way onto streets in cities besides London. The growler was a special, almost limousine hire vehicle that could carry up to 6 passengers and could be hailed at the roadside much like a modern taxi. But the real taxi of the day was the hansom cab. We associate the hansom cab with London, but its designer was actually born in Hinckley, and the first hansom cabs were operated in the city of York. They also went over to America, and some 4,500 hansom cabs were built in New York under license. Mail coaches often ran as stagecoaches along the same routes. Carrying the royal livery, these coaches were almost indistinguishable. We've said the practice was allowed because Wiedler's coaches were too expensive to stand idle. Spare coaches were needed to cover the mail route when repairing or refurbishing damaged coaches, or simply responding to the extra mail trips wanted by the postmaster. But how can we tell that this is an ordinary stagecoach running in Royal Mail Coach livery, but not a mail coach? Well, the answer's here. Because this man is not there. The only legal difference was that Royal Mail coaches carried Royal Mail Guard. The guards were the only men, it had to be a man, in the entire system who were employed by the General Post Office. The actual basis of the contract between the GPO and the operators was typically convoluted for the age. The operator actually contracted to carry the Royal Mail Guard, who in turn carried the Royal Mail. But it had to be done in an official Royal Mail coach. Everyone except the guard in the entire operation of stagecoaching was employed by the contracted operator or by a subcontractor. But the guard could be there even when it wasn't an official Royal Mail coach. Often the coach operator would dress drivers and guard postilions into smart official-looking uniforms with bugle horns or trumpets to toot along the way. If it looked like a mail coach, and it sounded like a mail coach, we had better treat it as a mail coach. It wasn't a good idea to delay or obstruct the Royal Mails. Indeed, it was a serious offence to interfere with the passage of the Royal Mails. Here we see a coach guard energetically trying to rouse a tardy toll gate keeper to open his gates. This toll gate keeper would be liable to a 40-shilling fine when he was reported. Repeated offences, usually 2 or 3 times, mean he would lose his job, and his house, and his future prospects. And if he was reported for violent conduct towards the guard or the passengers, he could be sent to prison as well as losing his job, or even deported to the colonies, because he would be charged as a highwayman. The GPO guard is legally allowed to use lethal force to protect the mails. As an ex-military man, he is expected to risk his life against highwaymen and robbers to protect the mails he is carrying. The post office provided each guard with a blunderbuss, a pair of horse pistols, and a cutlass at GPO expense. And the guards often bought more guns at their own expense just so that they could have more shots at a gang of ruffians that might be trying to hold up the coach. The truth is that very few highwaymen, robbers or footpads would take on a mail coach and its guard and passengers. The risk was considerable and the rewards not always of real value. Better to hold up a rich gentleman in his own carriage and relieve him and his lady of their personal valuables. The Royal Mail Guards were also provided with their yard of tin to sound the various calls and warnings for other road users and for coaching staffs at the various stopovers. What is also little known is that Royal Mail Guards were the first people to bring the correct time to the provinces. They each carried a Harrison-style chronometer diligently set to GMT to keep their coach to the minute of the timetable and ensure that post houses also kept an accurate time standard. The guards passed the time of day with the occupants of the post houses, and this was before the railways. With the Royal Mail also comes an association between the post office and a public room in a hotel, an inn, a coffee house, and occasionally a private house in towns along the route. Here, mail can be deposited by the public for a coach guard to collect, or personal mail can be collected when the mail coach had dropped it off. Sometimes the coach was unable to continue with the mails because of an accident, or the weather, or a mishap. Whenever this happened, if it could not be fixed, the guard would unhitch one of the horses and ride on to the next station. The mail guard had absolutely no legal responsibility for either the coach or the people. These were the responsibility of the owner-operator of the coach. The guard's only responsibility was to get the mail through if it was at all possible. And he had the right to demand assistance from anyone along the way. Did I mention mishap? This coach is called Quicksilver, and every night it carried the Devonport mail from London to the Devonport docks in 10¼ hours, the fastest average speed of a mail coach in the country, hence the name Quicksilver. On October the 20th, 1816, a few miles from Salisbury, the driver became alarmed at the skittish behaviour of his team. He stopped the coach near the Pheasant Inn, when a lioness leaped out of the darkness and attacked one of the lead horses. This story became famous when the injured horse, nursed back to health, toured with a dog and a lioness for many years, making a lot of money for the new owners. Travellers by stagecoach, adults as well as children, would often play simple games to pass the time. Some of these are familiar to us today, although rapidly being replaced by electronic devices. Games such as I Spy with My Little Eye, Paper, Scissors, Stone, Kim's Game, and Coffee Pots were popular. Coffee Pots is a game where you think of two words that sound the same but are spelt differently and mean different things, and then describe them. So you might say, my first coffee pot is a barrier that can give access to a road, a farm, or a private garden. And my second coffee pot describes the various speeds at which a horse can travel. Have you got it yet? A Tale of Gate and Gate. Toll gates and turnpikes became a regular feature for travelling on Britain's roads. The Royal Mail was exempt from all toll gate charges. The guard sounded his horn on approach, and the toll gate keeper ran out to open the gate, and the coach rattled through on its merry way. The guard might even give a short recital on his horn if you were lucky. This is the sovereign's mail, travelling on the sovereign's highways, so it's natural that they do not have to pay any tolls. An ordinary stagecoach should not be entitled to free passage of the toll gate. However, these coaches were operated by the same contractors, with uniformed drivers and postilion guards in smart tunics, best not to risk a delay. Arrangements were usually made for periodic season payments by the operators, on favourable terms, directly to the turnpike trusts and the local councils, and the toll gates were opened just as they would be for a Royal Mail coach. Most people could not see the difference between the mail coach and the stagecoach, so they treated both with appropriate respect. And what about a horse's gait? A horse is said to walk, trot, and canter. And as you may have noticed, each is in turn faster than the one that came before. It is said that the Dover to London stage's quick passage along the broad smooth highway above Canterbury, considered to be one of the best roads in England, was achieved by the Canterbury Trot, the canter. But no mail coach driver would ever allow his horses to gallop. Galloping is, of course, the fastest a horse can travel. And when the gallop is extended, the coach horse can go like a racehorse, clocking 30 miles an hour or even more. However, after 2 or 3 miles, a galloping horse will be blown, and it might take several hours or even days for the animal to recover, depending on the stress of the gallop. Galloping was exceedingly bad coachmanship. Apart from the risk of tiring out and damaging the valuable team of horses, it ran the risk of accident and injury. Most importantly, it put the mails at risk, and the GPO guard would be duty-bound to report any coachman who let his horses gallop. Each team of horses would draw a coach for a stage of between 10 and 15 miles, depending on the difficulty of the terrain. Each coach should average around 10 miles per hour for each stage. This could usually be accomplished by keeping the horses well in check. A famous cartoon of the time shows passengers and even the guard being thrown from a coach by a careless coachman who is galloping the ground. This coachman is unlikely to keep his job after such dangerous driving. The driver's only chance will be that passengers would swear to the reason beyond driver's control, or that the guard had ordered a gallop to escape from the threat of highwaymen. I love the way these people are sort of floating in the air as they fall off the coaches. A typical 4-horse team was a valuable asset to the mail coach, however. All horses used will be owned by the contracted operator, but the mail coach teams were usually run in matching pairs that were kept together to learn their routes and their positions. Each horse will be fitted with its own made-to-measure harness, adjusted to fit exactly, thereby avoiding fatigue and injury to the horses. Add to this a general rule of thumb that each coach needed one horse for every mile of its journey, and the horse teams became a serious investment. Strong chains attach a pair of drawbars to the main frame of the coach. The two wheelers are backed in and fastened to their drawbars. Both wheelers are a regular team and have specialized strong leather harnesses adjusted to fit them exactly. They also take up the same position in the front of the coach. Another set of strong chains now fastens each wheeler to the guide pole or tongue. If the wheeler turns to the left or right, they will pull the guide pole, steering the coach in that direction. And if they pull back, they can slow the coach down. The wheelers therefore control the slowing down and steering direction of the front wheels of the coach, hence they are called wheelers. These chains control the forward pull, and these chains control direction and rearward pull on the coach. The wheeler's back pressure will not stop the coach at full speed, however, or control the coach safely down a steep hill, such as Gunnerby Hill near Grantham. Fortunately, the driver also has a friction brake that can lock both the rear wheels. The best coach drivers were also excellent brakemen, using the brake carefully to control the coach and not tire the horses unnecessarily. The brake also had a ratchet that allowed it to be locked on when the coach was stationary. As a final protection, the driver, or more likely the guard, could fasten a skid or scotch to one or both of the rear wheels. This now locks the wheel and provides an increased area of contact with the road. Sometimes the skid would be fashioned as a plough, so that it dug into the road surface and increased the braking effect still further. Next, another set of strong chains fastened and bolted to the front of the guide poles. These chains are called the crab. And through the crab, another drawbar, called the main bar, is fastened firmly to the poles. The lead pair of horses, called leaders, can now be backed into the traces. And these can be fastened. The leaders are also regularly matched pair and always working together in front of the wheelers. The leaders are a younger pair and faster than the wheelers in all their gaits. The leaders set the speed and direction at which the coach is to travel, and the wheelers control the ongoing direction and slowing of the coach wheels. The ostler now quickly attaches and threads the reins, which are called ribbons, from the leaders back to the wheelers and up to the driver. He then trots off whilst the driver sorts out his ribbons, checks with the guard, and off we go. Four in hand is not just an expression. English driving literally drives four in hand. The left-hand leader's reins come up and go between the index and middle and forefinger. The right-hand leader's reins are held at the bottom of the fist, between the little finger and the ring finger. The left-hand wheeler's reins come back into the middle of the fist, as do the right-hand wheeler's reins. And now, by movement of the wrist or gently tugging on individual reins with the other hand, all four horses can be controlled, four in hand. The whip is only used to coax and tempt horses by just lightly touching on their flanks. Most of the driving is done by word of command. Continental drivers tend to go left and right hand, which really is a completely different style of driving. The right hand reins go into the right hand, the left hand reins go into the left hand, and by pulling on each hand you can control all four horses. By 1835 there were some 4,000 coaches on the roads, and here are some of the destinations that they serviced. The main routes became very busy, with a number of stage and mail coaches servicing, travelling down from London every day. From London to Brighton there were 40 coaches. To Birmingham there were also 40 coaches every day. Liverpool had 60 coaches. Chester had 20 coaches. Hull had 12 coaches. And York had 18 coaches. These are coloured in red because they're coming past the Muscombe. Of the 12 coaches that went to Hull, 6 coaches came up past the Muscombe and went across further north. Each of these coaches had a twin that started from the provincial town to come up to London. All the year round, at least 48 coaches a day are going along the old Great North Road at Muscombe. The actual figure for stage coaches in the summer of 1835 is 72 coaches per day, but few of these will be mail coaches. In part 2, we're going to look at the journey north. The journey goes from London to York. The coach service then goes on to Edinburgh, and it is measured at 399 miles in all. That is more or less 400 horses needed for the full trip. It could be completed on fine days in 42.5 hours, averaging close to 9.4 miles per hour. The same horses would usually be used for the later return run, so a team could get to know its ground. Pratt's high-test map of Great Britain, showing the Great North Road, shows the route from London to Newcastle-on-Tyne, and it was drawn in the 1920s. We intend only to travel northwards to York. But what might the full journey to Edinburgh cost? As it happens, we've got a detailed account of a young lady who travelled to Edinburgh to get married. The cost of the through ticket was £9, 19 shillings and sixpence. Interesting the way it just misses being £10. And by the time all the other costs are added on, the total bill for her journey is £14, 14 shillings and fourpence. She's also travelling with a maid, and we've got an account of the maid's costs as well. The maid rode on the outside of the coach at half price. The cost then was £4, 19 shillings and ninepence. Her overnight accommodation was only 2 and sixpence, and meals and beverages only cost 2 shillings and 11pence. So the maid got to Edinburgh for £5, 5 shillings and 10p. By 1835, the coaching era is generally considered to reach its zenith. At this time, there are around 700 mail coaches and 3,300 stage coaches on the roads of Britain. That's 4,000 coaches. 40,000 people are employed as coachmen, postilion guards, ostlers and horsekeepers. That includes farriers, blacksmiths, leather workers, coach services, etc., and employed by the operators. A further 45,000 people are gainfully employed as casuals, harness oilers, fodder and dung carriers, general cleaners, polishers, food vendors, etc. About 6,000 people are employed as servants, cooks, bedders and maids at the stopover inns and hostelries. About 160,000 horses need to be owned by the operators at any one time to service this fleet. And the post office also employs about 1,500 Royal Mail Guards. Coaching has become a major UK communications industry. So let's take a break. Part 2 is on the same site on YouTube, so I hope to see you there. And in Part 2, we'll take a coach journey from London through to York. See you later.